Chapter 6 of Almond-Blossom. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Wadsley. Chapter 6. Happy hearts and happy faces, happy play in grassy places. That was how in ancient ages children grew to kings and sages. But the unkind and the unruly, and the sort who eat unduly, they must never hope for glory. Theirs is quite a different story. R.L.S. When G discovered, some months after his father's departure, that Rex was very slightly crippled, she cabled to Tony for his instructions. When none came, she began to pilgrimage to famous surgeons. In her code, it was a thing unforgivable. It should have been impossible for one of the family to be maimed, for the stock to have a blemish. The idea was repugnant and humiliating, and paradoxically it awoke in her the strongest emotion she had ever known. There sprang up for Rex a love which had never bloomed for any other living being, even her own son. Patiently, tirelessly, she journeyed with Rex and Emilia and Doro to Paris, New York, Geneva, Berlin, Copenhagen, in search of some man who could make a tiny crooked limb straight, and she would have travelled to Tibet had she received assurance that the miracle could be performed there. Of Tony she had no news. Occasionally a message came from him containing no information, save a rough indication of his whereabouts, probably 2 months earlier. G bothered not at all about him. He would return. The code allowed the men of the family to roam. They invariably came back to Hurst Point. The code decreed that they should. When Rex was 8 and had been seen by and made firm friends with about a dozen most eminent surgeons of the day, they returned en famille to settle down at home. "And a good thing too," Doro said. "I can ride now, can't I, G?" "Naturally," G agreed. But she had not bargained for a vision of her adopted relative seated on a pony which bucked the very first morning of their arrival, stable boys and grooms in hot pursuit, and Doro's head upflung, her face extremely white, her green eyes blazing with terrified yet glorious excitement. G and Rex watched her, G secretly trembling a little, Emilia openly wailing. The pony bucked down the avenue. A groom approached him, and he went off at a gallop. Doro sat well back, her small hands gripping the rough mane, her own curls blown back like a dark flame. "God!" G told herself. "If I didn't know the child had no breeding, I should swear she had." Doro landed almost at her feet, and faced her instantly. "You said naturally when I asked," she stated. She was visibly trembling, but she stood her ground. Emilia caught her up in her arms, and began to kiss her wildly. "Put Miss Doro down," G commanded instantly. She held out her veined, slender hand to Doro. "From today you will ride with a groom and leading rein, my dear." "I adore you," Doro replied intensely. She had heard Pasquale Greville say that to G, and had seen her smile. Besides, she was grateful and wanted to say so, and particularly say it rightly. "Thank you," G responded as gravely. "You had better let Emilia undress and bathe you now. When you are ready, let her bring you to Rex and me on the terrace." Greville, home on a brief leave, and amused by G, was staying at the house. He strolled on to the terrace now, his head gleaming in the sunshine, a cigarette between his lips. "Where have you been?" G asked him. "In the library." "You missed a rather enjoyable and quite nerve-devastating sight. Doro managed to mount one of the ponies and rode it down the avenue. The beast bucked badly. She did not fall." "I wish I had seen that," Greville agreed. "A thoroughly good sight. One imagines, G, that child will be a personality some day. No nerves, superb health, green eyes, and made rather like a mythical being, so straightly and fairly. What will you bet, my dear, that she won't fashion life?" "It is a pity she is not of our blood," G returned rather absently. Doro appeared, walking towards them. She had on a little holland frock, and white socks with black strap shoes. She looked innocuous, extremely pretty, and marvellously clean, the typical good child of the fairy tale. "Hello, Alice," Greville called. "Come here." She went obediently, and, leaning against him, bent to smell the tiny gloire de Dijon in his buttonhole. "I hear you have been very enterprising." "What does that mean?" "Oh, courageous and adventurous, daring, in your understanding." "That's a good deal to make one word mean," Doro said. "Do you pay it extra?" Greville was delighted with her quickness. He had called her Alice, but he had not expected her to know her looking-glass so well. Even had she caught the allusion. "I think I should win my bet," he remarked to G over Doro's head. "A good memory proves very little," G said rather tartly. "The dullest people often have one, and take it to themselves to glory, and even seem to consider it an achievement. Why, heaven knows, since it is mostly a matter of chance, like having a squint, or the wrong sort of speaking voice. You either have it or you haven't. Despite all this craze for mental exercises to strengthen the memory, which of course only benefit people who have one already, and for them to pay a fee for such a purpose is on a par, to my way of thinking, with thanking your feet for walking. However, evolution, I suppose, and it helps the mania for self-analysis, a most dangerous interest I consider, as if every one of us, if we ever do confess honestly, did not spend all our spare time concentrating on ourselves, and now to invent excuses to enable one to do it more intensively. Psychoanalysis will be the ruin of quick living, the only way to live, and nice slow thinking that never hampered your action at all. And those things have kept the world a pretty decent place up to now, take it all in all. Meddling with instincts, focusing any interest on him, is a mistake, believe me. Dissection only serves one purpose, the growth of practical knowledge, and one's instincts, like the origin of fire, will for ever remain an eternal mystery, and should do. 'Pon my soul, it's a relief to me to think there is something that can't be explained by science, or muddled up by it. Her eyes rested almost tragically on Rex as he ran across to Doro. "One is expected to grant science supernatural power, and it has not yet discovered how to straighten a crooked limb." Greville stared. Like all men of his type, any emotion of a distressing nature vaguely annoyed him. "Rex's limb will not handicap him," he said indifferently. "He is quite a decent height for his age. He will probably grow tall, like all of us, and he's a good-looking little beggar." Rex turned towards them as he spoke. He was standing on the terrace steps, and his deformity was concealed. The sun poured over him, making his fair hair a cap of gleaming gold, throwing into his dark eyes little golden dancing reflections. G's mouth softened as she looked at him, quivered a very little, and she said with determination, "Special stirrups, of course, and so on. One can arrange everything." "Is he at all nervous?" Greville asked perfunctorily. There was in his voice none of the amused pleasure it had held whilst he had spoken of Doro. Intuitively he resented Rex's shortened limb. Such a thing offended his sense of the beautiful, which he had cultivated until it had become of a diseased fastidiousness. He had that vague contempt for Rex some people always feel with regard to any oddity in life or humanity. G laughed lightly, derisively. "My dear Pan!" The tone, the laugh, stirred Greville's vanity. Never a heavy sleeper, he was used to quiescence from women, young or old. He said now, his beautiful eyes half closed, a faint smile on his lips, "Doro's stunt would have been rather beyond him, alas." "Doro is nearly 3 years older than Rex," G said in the sharp voice of hurt age. She rose and went to Rex and took his hand, and walked away with him, keeping him on the side of her farthest from Greville's vision. Rex went with her gaily. He adored her, had no fear of her whatever. There was between them the strangest, strongest companionship and genuine love. Perhaps because of his poor foot, perhaps merely owing to the very forceful impression of herself, her views, G left on people, Rex was, without being precocious or even advanced, extremely understanding. He was still a very little boy, but he had a natural sweetness, a rather penetrating sweetness somehow, and all the reckless delightfulness of childhood, allied to a mentality intensely stimulated by G, and one which had received a good deal of assistance towards development from his wandering life. G had taught him to read very early, and at the age of 8½ he read as he chose, and his choice was decidedly interesting. He adored horses, and had a great love of boxing, and had read nearly every old book in the big library on both subjects. And he adored fairy stories too, and funny long tales out of the old household words which filled one shelf. His speech was polyglot, and the more attractive because it was so. Emilia talked to him in Spanish. G often spoke French. Rex used bits of either language. He had a certain very charming clearness of enunciation and deliberation in his speech, which gave an odd, rather dear little effect of dignity. Perhaps this had been fostered by G's insistence that he should, directly he was old enough, take his own position in the house. She had explained to him that he represented his father, and that to do so was a distinction. Rex, like every child, loved playing a part, and secretly enjoyed his role enormously. Entirely normal, despite his collection of attributes, he had days of devilishness like every other small boy, and very usual needs and wants. Today, Doro's spirited performance had naturally made him long to go and do likewise. He said so. G? Yes, darling. I too should like to ride, I think, G's hold on his hand tightened for a moment. You are not quite big enough. I could have a very little pony, my darling, the littlest ever. He had a store of what he called dear words, which he used solely for G, and for which loyalty in her heart she worshipped him. She looked down and met his eyes, determined, very clear, and hopeful. You do not think you would be frightened, Rex? Doro wasn't. Doro is older. Do you think that matters, my love? If I would be frightened, I expect I'll be it later on just as easily as now. He stopped and stood before her, and said with eager earnestness, Let's just take a very little look at the stables, shall we? It was noon. The stable yard was hot and empty. The pleasant sound of water rushing somewhere above broke the silence. This is where Rufus lives, Rex announced. He's no end of a devil, Sam says. G laughed. She opened Rufus's door and went in to him. Back went his sleek little ears. He shivered. The whites of his wicked beautiful eyes showed for a second. Put me up, G, Rex begged, shivering too with excitement, his eyes blazing, his yellow hair ruffled by an impatient hand. G lifted him easily, but she was short, and Rex was not very big. He caught at Rufus' mane, and tugged himself on to his back. Rufus lashed out with temper, but G, to whom fear was a thing unknown, never moved, though about her there seemed a welter of little vicious gleaming hoofs, and white-rimmed angry eyes. But Rex screamed once, and as if it had been a command, Rufus stopped kicking and was still. G lifted Rex down. Neither spoke. In the stable yard Greville was standing. He had been watching with Doro. G's face coloured very slowly, very faintly. She met Greville's smile. Ah, you here? Hot, isn't it? And surely it must be nearly lunch time? Rex's hand was quivering and unclasping within hers. Greville looked at his wrist-watch. Then his amused glance rested on his small nephew. "Still frightened?" he asked. "No," Rex said. His voice shook a very little. Greville laughed. "Doro will have to teach you," he said teasingly. "She is brave, anyway." Rex went on looking quite directly at him, but his face flushed vividly. He loosed G's hand as Greville finished speaking, and sprang awkwardly straight at him. You beast!" he said chokingly. There was a second's utter silence. G's voice cut into it imperiously. "Rex, apologize to your uncle at once." Rex turned to her. His lips opened, shut again. G's eyes, dominant to all the rest of the world, appealed to him. The colour drained slowly from his face. He said in his quietest voice, "I apologize, Uncle Pan." He waited a second, then alone walked across the big yard, through the high gates and on towards the house. G after a moment followed him slowly. Doro looked at Greville, considering him gravely. "You were a beast, you know," she said tranquilly. "Boys hate to be laughed at before girls. So do men." "Do they indeed? Why, I wonder?" "'Cause they are so vain," Doro said indifferently. "And how do you know that, Mademoiselle Sagesse?" "G said so. I heard her tell Lord Donymore in Paris, that old thin little man with the moustaches like tiny white swords, who laughed in a wheeze, and he said being vain made you it's a long word, but G said it means get atable, and if men weren't so vain, women would have a slow time. Why?" Greville, since his stay at Hurst Point, had begun to cultivate towards the word "why" that feeling of helplessly enraged irritation, occasioned in the soul by the presence of an active mosquito when you long to sleep, and cannot catch the insect, and are powerless to resist it. "Why?" Doro asked again. Greville appealed for heavenly assistance in 2 words. "God knows," he said. "Yes, he knows everything," Doro returned sapiently. "Mustn't it be queer never to have to wonder? And of course he can't if he always knows. Should you like being like that, Pan?" She had called him Pan from the very first. The luncheon gong boomed deeply from the house. Doro danced up and down. "Tea, food! Race you to the terrace, Pan, darling." "Oh, I've a bone in my leg," Greville protested basely. "So have I. So's everyone. Lots." She let clear, kindly contempt rest on him for that old prevarication. "Don't be a fool. Come on." Laughing, he raced, and asked Doro as they reached the house who allowed her to say fool. "Everyone says it," Doro returned blithely. "Emilia and G and Rex and me. You. Often I've heard you." She danced into the hall where lunch was laid on a round table in one of the big window embrasures, and gave a shriek of joy. "Duck! Oh, duck! How heavenly! Lots of stuffin', please, Wickham," she commanded the butler. "And get a move on too, please." G corrected her, laughed, damned the apple sauce. The children at their lunch drank sherry in special little glasses. G had drunk sherry in her childhood, and had still, as she phrased it, the palate of a gourmand, and the digestion of an ostrich. 2 facts which proved to her conclusive satisfaction that her upbringing was worthy of imitation. Rex at the head of the table looked pale but composed. He was deadly polite to Greville. He was just a little boy in 1,000 ways, but in 1 or 2 others he was extraordinarily advanced, and he had been encouraged to exercise his intuition. Now, sitting at the head of his table, G facing him at the other end, he watched his guest with steady, dark eyes, and hated him. From that day he resented Greville in his life, and despised him. For his vanity had not been hurt, but his trust in the decency of those grown-ups who belonged to him, and should therefore have been generous, had been destroyed in the case of Greville for ever by his taunt. "I was afraid, but I did stick on." Rex told himself. From that day he never willingly stayed with Greville or talked closely with him. Today his funny little dignity, which can make a child so unapproachable, visibly surrounded him. He had the quaintest, yet quite natural, old-fashioned manners, severe and stately, inculcated by G, and now he sat at lunch with his kinsman, when G and Doro had left, waiting with patient courtesy until Greville should have drunk his cognac and coffee, when he would be free to go. "What are you doing this afternoon?" Greville asked him idly. "I don't know," Rex answered. Like all children, he detested questions. "Going to read? Drive?" "I don't think so." "Doesn't anyone plan your time for you?" "No." Rex's composure, which Greville chose to consider merely conceit, a result of having been badly spoilt, irritated him obscurely. He knew, with the quick intuition of vanity, he had lost ground with Rex, and he felt resentment against Rex for having put him in a position to do so. Behind, on the terrace, invisible to Rex, a figure halted, a man's. He walked towards the window. Greville's eyes expressed a second's intense surprise. Then he said, very languidly, "Ah, Tony." And to Rex, "Your father." Rex wheeled on the instant. His small face, dead white with excitement, gazed into the dark one of the man before him. He was a highly strung boy. He hesitated, then flushed scarlet, then advanced. I am Rex, your son," he said. Tony bent down and picked him up, then oddly, awkwardly, set him on his feet again very quickly. "Tell the people I am back, will you, Pasquale?" he said in a curiously slow voice. Greville left the room. Tony and Rex were alone together. Tony sat down suddenly. "Come here," he said to Rex. Rex went unhesitatingly and stood between his knees, a small hand on each. The two looked long at one another. "You didn't write much," Rex said. "No, I suppose not." Rex struggled to make conversation. "Am I like the son you thought I would be?" "You're damn like her," Tony said heavily. His utterance was almost uncouth. He had lived alone so long that speech had become a rare thing with him. All the years he had spoken but when he had been forced to do so. For the last 4 years he had been the only white man within a radius of 100 miles. He had come home because an epidemic had broken out in his district. He had given his house as a hospital, and watched men die by the score. He had not intended to return even when he had left Saivunga, but he had trekked to a port, and a boat had been leaving, and he had found several letters of G's, and he had thought he might as well go back for a little. London had terrified him. He had become blunted, but fear had pierced his heavy armour of insensibility, and he had fled as one possessed, haunted, to Hurst Point. He felt nothing now save a dull perplexity. G came in, a bright spot of colour on either thin cheek, and after one swift glance at him, greeted him quite casually. "You haven't lunched?" "No." "Ah, I'll have some sent in at once." Wickham came in with a tray, and nearly wept with joy to see his master, but Rexford merely nodded, muttered the man's name. The welcome petered out, because a little ridiculous. Rexford ate and drank largely. The household tiptoed to the door, eager, glad. He nodded to them too, inarticulately. "What a Shavian rendering of the Wanderer's Return!" Greville murmured with malicious amusement. He was genuinely amused, but G was not. The code demanded no hysterical ebullition, naturally, when a member of the clan came home. But such a return! She faced Tony across his own table, a cigarette in her hand, her dark eyes glowing. "Anthony, please listen." "I am," he said, in the same stocky, almost stupid way. "Then take heed. Your position demands certain things. One is consideration to those you employ. I beg you to show it. You had better make a little speech of thanks for their welcome." "Why?" G brought a clenched hand down on the dark wood table. "Decency of feeling. Your sense of responsibility." "Rot," Tony said lethargically. She looked closely at him. This man was the real man. She sensed that in the instant. Appeal would be useless. She rose and went to the window, tears of grief and a sharp humiliation in her eyes. She could not have described her feelings, but she knew they were poignant and pathetic. She turned to look again at Tony. All his fine air of athleticism had gone. He, like his mind, had thickened. It was almost as if some invisible coating had been welded over him, not quite effacing, but dimming all the old features of his personality. He was not obese, but he looked dully solid, and his face was burnt, and the whites of his eyes permanently bloodshot by the sun. His thick hair looked lifeless, his fingers broad-tipped and uncared for. Of course his clothes were grotesque, but that could be remedied. And the rest? G asked herself wretchedly. For now I shall not be expected to stay. And the children, Rex, and his father. She clasped her hands in sudden impotence. Her age seemed to crowd upon her in that moment. She felt the weight of the years for the first time. She wheeled suddenly. "Anthony," she said, almost desperately. He rose and crossed to her. "What's up, G, my dear?" "Anthony, what do you mean to do?" "To do? Now that you're home, now that you will have the children to educate?" "They'll be all right, won't they? I noticed the boy's right foot. Odd. A pity." G laughed that she might not cry. "Oh, yes," she said, controlling her voice with difficulty. A vision of those wearying pilgrimages to one surgeon after another trailing through her tired mind. "Oh, yes, but Doro is all right." "Good. I'd better see her, hadn't I?" "I'll ring for her to come down." They waited in silence for Doro's appearance. She came in quickly. Her eyes saw Rexford instantly. She stood for a second, poised on her narrow feet, her eyes wide, brilliant, her lips parted a little. Then with a swallow's dart she had reached him, was clinging to him, calling his name, "Tony, Tony!" rapturously. She drew herself upright by clutching at his coat and looked into his face. "You've come back! Oh, heavenly! Gee, isn't it beautiful lovely? Oh, Tony, aren't you glad to see me? Yes, yes, you must be. Oh, Tony, I love you." Tony's stolid face broke a little. He smiled. "Kiss me quick, fast!" Doro commanded. She rubbed her cheek to his. "Goodness, you're all prickly. Is that being abroad? Do you grow like that? Tony, I can ride. I did, didn't I, G? And Tony, I can speak in French and sing it. Oh, I love you, darling dear." G left them together, her heart, jealous for Rex, contracting with bitterness. As she went, she heard Tony laugh, a sort of dull roar, but no one else had won a smile from him. And soon they were walking, Doro and he, together in the park. Rex came up to G. "Fathers are strange people," he said ruminatively. "Of course I do not remember mine, G, but he seems very unfatherlike, don't you think? Course Doro knew him before. That makes a difference." He stood watching the big figure and the little white-clad one casting shadows on the brilliant grass. "It'll be odd to have one always about the place," he remarked at length, speaking of a father, much as one would of a wheel-chair or any other mechanical device. And suddenly his arms went around G's neck. He clung to her with the passionate abandonment a child can feel when it is unhappy. "We never liked surprises, did we?" he whispered. "You always said, darlin', they were a mistake." Chapter 7.